Greetings, my friends, and welcome to this first of 12 messages on the book of Deuteronomy. The very fact that you are here tells me that you have some interest in this often neglected book. Deuteronomy is the last book of the Pentateuch. Much of the book is a presentation of laws that God gave specifically to the nation of Israel, laws that do not apply directly to us in the church today. Many people have set out with the very admirable goal of reading through the entire Bible, starting at Genesis. Deuteronomy is often where they give up. After reading through the extensive legal sections of Exodus and Leviticus and the long genealogies of Numbers, the book of Deuteronomy can appear to be endless. It can feel repetitious and even irrelevant. Yet I believe that if we take some time to consider the historical setting of this book and to look at some of its key themes, we will discover that this book is actually quite fascinating and that it has much value for us who live in the 21st century. Allow me to give you now an introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. Let's begin by considering the author of Deuteronomy. Like the first 4 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Deuteronomy, except for the record of his own death, was written by Moses. This book contains the last words of Moses, and last words are often important words. Next, let's consider the structure of the book. Deuteronomy is essentially a series of 3 messages or discourses that Moses delivered to the Israelites. Those 3 messages fill chapters 1 through 30. Chapters 31 through 34 give us a record of the farewell of Moses to the Israelites and his death. In the very event of the death of Moses, we see one of the key purposes of the book. Deuteronomy served to prepare that generation of Israelites for the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua. As we seek to understand the book of Deuteronomy, perhaps the most important factor that we need to consider is the historical setting. The year is 1406 BC. 40 years earlier, in 1446 BC, God had freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. You probably know the story of the 10 miraculous plagues that God used to judge the Egyptians and to convince them to release the Israelites. When Pharaoh finally allowed the Israelites to leave, they had to depart in haste. Pharaoh soon regretted his decision to free the slaves who had brought such prosperity to his kingdom. He took his entire army and pursued the Israelites. God then performed perhaps the greatest miracle of the Exodus, when he parted the sea and allowed the Israelites to cross on dry land, and then used the sea to drown Pharaoh and his armies as they attempted to follow the Israelites. With the demise of Pharaoh's armies, the people of Israel suddenly found themselves to be truly free. Yet they had a new problem. They were in a vast and inhospitable wilderness with no source of food or water. They cried out to God, and he began to do what he would do for the next 40 years. He provided food in the form of manna, and he split the rocks and brought forth water from the earth. Manna and water was a very repetitious diet, but it was nourishing, and the Israelites never went hungry during those 40 years. God soon led the Israelites to Mount Sinai. There he gave them the 10 Commandments. He also gave them the civil law and instructed them in the laws of sacrifice and offering. The Israelites spent nearly a year and a half at Mount Sinai. During that time, they constructed the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and the rest of the equipment that God had specified for their worship. God then led them to a place called Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea was the southern gateway to the territory that we call the Promised Land, territory that at that time was occupied and controlled by the Canaanites. God told the Israelites that he was giving them the land of Canaan. At Kadesh Barnea, he instructed them to enter the land, to exterminate the Canaanites, and to settle in Canaan. In other words, God commanded them to begin what we today call the conquest. Many people who read the Bible today are outraged by God's instructions to the Israelites. How could a holy God send one people into the land of another people with specific instructions to wipe out that other people entirely? The answer to this question is complex, but the heart of the matter is simply that the Canaanites were an extremely wicked people. Archaeology confirms what the Bible reports. The Canaanites were a deeply corrupt people. Their religious practices included idolatry, the use of temple prostitutes, sex with animals, and even human sacrifice. We rightly recoil when we read of God's command to the Israelites to exterminate the Canaanites. The story of how they carried out that task, recorded partly in the book of Numbers and partly in the book of Joshua, makes us cringe for good reasons. Yet we must accept that God's reasons for the conquest were valid. And we cannot help but recognize that the Israelites themselves, as they carried out the gruesome task of exterminating the Canaanites, must have come to realize in a deeper way than ever God's hatred of human sin. But let's get back to Kadesh Barnea. The Israelites arrived there in 1444, less than 2 years after departing from Egypt. They sent 12 spies into Canaan to examine the land and its people. The spies returned with a very favorable report regarding the land itself. It was fertile, well-watered, and ideal for agriculture. But their report regarding the Canaanite people was anything but favorable. The Canaanites had walled cities for defense. They were well-armed, and their soldiers were well-trained. Worst of all, some of them were giants. Of the 12 spies, 10 advised Moses and the people to give up on the idea of conquest and instead to return to Egypt. Only Joshua and Caleb disagreed. They urged the Israelites to trust God to grant them success. Don't fear the Canaanites. Yes, they are strong, but God will give us victory by his miraculous power, just as he did over the Egyptians. Sadly, the people as a whole agreed with the 10 spies that victory over the Canaanites was impossible, rebelling against God's command. As a penalty for their refusal to obey him, God declared that no one over the age of 20 on that day would live to enter the promised land except for Caleb and Joshua. God kept his promise. For the next 38 years, he led the Israelites back and forth in the wilderness, always providing for their needs but never allowing them to enter the promised land. By the time that the year 1406 BC rolled around, every Israelite who had been 20 years old or older at the time of the Kadesh Barnea rebellion had died in the wilderness. Joshua, Caleb, and Moses were the only exceptions. At this point, God once again instructed the Israelites to begin the conquest, but this time on the east side of the Dead Sea. Unlike their now gone parents, they obeyed. God gave them victory over the kings, Sihon and Og, and their armies. The men of the tribes of Reuben and Gad settled their wives and children in these newly conquered lands. It was then, when the people of Israel were camped on the east of the Jordan, opposite Jericho, that Moses delivered the 3 discourses that are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. As they listened, the Israelites knew what lay ahead of them. First, there was the difficult task of conquering Canaan and exterminating the Canaanites. Then there would follow the blessing of settling in and populating the fertile lands of Canaan. Who exactly were these Israelites who heard the messages recorded in the book of Deuteronomy? Some of them, the ones who had been under the age of 20 at Kadesh Barnea, had experienced the events of the Exodus from Egypt. They had watched as God defeated the gods and the armies of Egypt. They had seen the 10 plagues. They had passed through the sea. They had heard the very voice of God thundering down from the peak of Mount Sinai when he first revealed the 10 Commandments. But the majority of those who were camped at the east of the Jordan and who heard the discourses of Deuteronomy were younger. They had been born during the 38 years of desert wanderings. To them, the events of the Exodus were only stories told by their parents. They hadn't witnessed the plagues or the Exodus. They had not been present when God gave the 10 Commandments and laid out the laws of Leviticus through Moses. Here we begin to see the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy for that generation. The English title of Deuteronomy comes from a Latin phrase meaning second law. Deuteronomy is, among other things, a second declaration of God's law to the nation of Israel. That second declaration was needed because the generation that grew up during the wilderness needed to know the law. They needed to understand the holiness of God and to know the danger of disobeying him. They were about to undertake a daunting task, the conquering of a land and a people who, according to any sensible measure of power or ability, should have been able to defeat the Israelites without breaking a sweat. Only by understanding the power and the holiness of God, and especially by understanding His demand for obedience, could they hope to succeed. In the remaining messages of this series, we will explore the book of Deuteronomy. We will discover some things that will come as no surprise: the dangers of life in Canaan, and the warnings that God will give to the Israelites, particularly regarding the temptation to follow the Canaanites in their idolatrous practices. We will also discover some things that may surprise you, such as the fact that Deuteronomy speaks more of the love of God than any other Old Testament book, and the fact that Deuteronomy contains prophecy that explains the sad story of the rise and fall of the nation of Israel that occupies the remainder of the Old Testament. I encourage you to begin reading the book of Deuteronomy for yourself. As you read, try to put yourself into the shoes of an Israelite man or woman who had grown up in the wilderness. As you read, reflect on the many years of eating nothing but manna and water in the wilderness. Try to imagine how you would have felt as you anticipated settling down in the Promised Land, a land that you had been told flowed with milk and honey, where comfortable homes and the best of food await you. Try to picture in your mind how it must have felt to know that only through obedience to God could victory over the better trained and better equipped Canaanite armies be possible. If you do your best to read this book through the eyes of its first audience, I believe that you will find it not boring, but instead fascinating. I also believe that you will begin to see how this ancient book, written 3,400 years ago to a different people in a different corner of the world, still has value as a guide to understanding the one true God, the God who led the Israelites through the wilderness like a loving father, and who still cares for His children today in the same fatherly way. See you in our next episode.